A gute Woche. The Rebbe soll gesund sein began the Farbrengen this afternoon that today is really an unusual Farbrengen. And immediately while mentioning about the fact that it is unusual, he referred to the Gemara, which the Alter Rebbe quotes in Tanya, that there's a concept of an Oved Elokim and there is a Lo Yavodai. The Gemara explains this pasuk, who is called an Oved Elokim and who is referred to as a Lo Yavodai. Chazal tell us, Einei Doima Sheine Pirkei Meya Pa'amim L'Sheine Pirkei Meya Pa'amim Ve'echad. We cannot compare the one who learns 100 times, reviews an Inyan 100 times, as to the one who reviews an Inyan 101 times. The one who reviews it 101 is considered an Oved Elokim. The one who reviews only 100 is not considered an Oved Elokim, as Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, based on what the Gemara says. Pshat is, in those days, people used to learn, there was no Torah Sheba'al Peh, so all learning was done by heart. So the difference between whether it is 100 times or 101, Mefarshim comment, difference is whether one learns the usual amount of Chazarah, which is usually common, or a person goes out of the ordinary and chazars more than it is usually accepted. And in those days, being that he would learn by heart, Emor refers, Sheine Pirkei Meya Pa'amim Ve'echad, if one would chazar over an Inyan 101 times, by chazaring it over that many times, he would really go above the usual system of chazara, and therefore he would remember it. Getting back to our Inyan, so we see already from Chazal that there's an Inyan that's done usual and an unusual Inyan. Even the one who is only learning 100 times, and we refer to him that he is not an Oved Elokim, the Alter Rebbe adds on the word Kara'ui. We cannot say that he's not servicing Hashem Yisbarach. Alter Rebbe says he's not servicing HaKadosh Baruch Hu as it should be. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, we're talking here about an individual who has been learning an Inyan, reviewing an Inyan in Torah 100 times. And as it seems from the Gemara, this individual, after he reviewed the Inyan 100 times, is not going to be Mevatel Torah. He reviews this Inyan 100 times, and then he gets involved in another Inyan in Torah. In other words, we're talking about a person who's really heavily involved in learning Torah. Otherwise, if after he's chazad an Inyan Meya Pa'amim, and then he's not mamshech in learning altogether, then here comes in what Alter Rebbe tells us right away in the first parak of Tanya. If a person has an opportunity to learn and does not utilize this opportunity, Alter Rebbe says what this is considered. And the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, that is the Torah Shebiksav of Chasidus, and right away in the first parak, this is what he tells us. So we're talking about a person who's really heavily involved in learning. However, being that he does not go out of his usual, out of the ordinary system, and he only reviews an Inyan 100 times, therefore he's considered an Einei Oved Elokim Karoi, as opposed to the person who does review an Inyan more than 100 times, 101 times, this one is considered as a proper Oved Elokim. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, there's an Indian concept of Lefnim Mishuras Adin. There is din, there is halacha. Then we know one could be machmir and go above beyond the requirement of halacha. Once halacha is quoted in Shulchan Aruch, and the Lefnim Mishuras Adin as well is also quoted in Shulchan Aruch, then this Lefnim Mishuras Adin becomes din already. Why? Because it is quoted in Shulchan Aruch. So for one to go out of the unusual, to do an unusual thing and do out of the ordinary, he has to go even further than the Lefnim Mishuras Adin, which is quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. Back to our Inyan, Rabbi says the Farbrengen is an unusual Farbrengen, because, however, there are two Inyanim which did bring about to the Farbrengen. Firstly, yesterday was Beis Iyah, Teferes Shebe Teferes, and that is the Yom Haledes, the birthday of the Rebbe Maharash, the Rebbe who is known for this famous expression of L'katchila Ariber. And also it says we are not in a position to evaluate differences between Rabbeim. However, the Frierdiker Rebbe has told us that by the Rebbe Marash there were many Baal Shemske inyanim. Inyanim al derech ha-Baal Shem. So the Rebbe says, this was yesterday, this was Beiziyah. Today is Shabbos. The question is whether to make a Farbrengen and Shabbos, which is perhaps there are some people who he's interfering with their Menucha Shabbos by the fact that he's Farbrengen this afternoon. However, to make a Farbrengen yesterday, Friday, on the day of Beiziyah, this is a day when everybody's busy with preparations for Shabbos. We find even in Chazal, Benegeya Kriyas HaTorah. Find the Gemara tells us that the Gemara takes into consideration a fact that a day is a Yom HaMaisa, a day of work when people have to go into work. The Gemara, Avacha Dikatog, when the Gemara discusses the inyan of Kriyas HaTorah in the weekdays, the Gemara takes into consideration the fact that people have to go to work, and therefore can we detain them a little bit longer in shul for Kriyas HaTorah and add on an additional aliyah, or can we not? So we see how much Chazal have given consideration to the fact of detaining people. However, being that yesterday it was impossible to make the Farbrengen because people were busy with Achanas for Erev Shabbos, and it is the day after Beis Iyar. In fact, it is the Shabbos right after the Friday, and it's, Rabbi says, as we see from Svarim, the relationship between a Friday and a Shabbos is much stronger than a relationship between two consecutive days, one day after another, one following day to another. So Mamela, this day has a very strong shayches to yesterday, which was the birthday of the Rebbe Marash. Particularly this year, it marks 150 years of the Rebbe Marash's birth. The number of 150 is 3 times a Yovel. Yovel is 50 years. And we find in Torah the number of Yovel is considered a tkufa of La'olam. La'olam. And Olam is a period of 50 years. And here we have 3 times 50. So this is one inyan which is of significance to bring about a Farbrengen. Another inyan is the fact that this is the Shabbos when we finish the first week of this new inyan of learning Rambam. The inyan of the Rambam, learning the Rambam, has begun on Sunday, this past Sunday, and now by this Shabbos it is the first week where we completing of this new inyan of everyone participating in a shiur of Rambam. Everyone in the 3 different ways, as the Rebbe has suggested the learning of the Rambam. And in each one of these ways, this is already the first week of learning the Rambam. And as discussed in the previous Farbrengens, the idea of learning Rambam, firstly it brings to a unity, to an achdus amongst all the participants that are learning this Rambam. And secondly, it also gives us the opportunity of fulfilling the inyan of getting acquainted in all of the Taryag mitzvahs, learning all the mitzvahs and being acquainted and familiar with all of these mitzvahs. The 3 different ways which the Rebbe has introduced and asks us to participate in learning of the Rambam, for the one who is capable and can keep up to doing so, to learn 3 prakim of Rambam each and every day. And if we were to learn 3 prakim of Rambam daily, by next year, approximately to next Erev Pesach, which Erev Pesach is the birthday of the Rambam, we will have completed all the 83 halachas in the Rambam. For those who cannot keep up with learning 3 prakim of Rambam daily, the Rebbe suggests they at least learn 1 perek of Rambam on a daily basis, and by learning 1 perek Rambam on a daily basis, it will take us approximately 3 years. And being that there is a leap year in the middle where we gain an additional month, the siyum will come out in a little less than 3 years. The Rebbe suggested that the proper day for the siyum would be on Chof Tevis, which is the Yoltzeit of the Rambam, a little less than 3 years from now. For children or women or those who cannot participate in this as well, then the Rebbe suggested they learn the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam which is also a sefer from the Rambam, written by the Rambam himself, though the Yad HaChazaka was written by the Rambam in Hebrew, in the text as we have it, as opposed to the Sefer HaMitzvahs, which the Rambam wrote in Arabic, and we have it in a translation. However, the Rambam himself has said that it is an authentic and reliable translation which we can rely on. They at least learn the inyonim in the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam, which correspond to those halachas of the Rambam, which are learned by those who are learning Rambam on a daily basis. And in fact, the Emor Shir, which is a guide, were published last week, and there are Emor Shir to each of these separate ways of learning the Rambam, and it can be obtained in 770. According to the system of learning 3 Prokim Rambam on a daily basis, first part of this week went before the Rambam writes a sefer, the Rambam lists all the mitzvahs asay and all the mitzvahs lois asay, and the introduction of the Rambam. After all that, it is today that it is Perik Zayin Ches and Tes, and yesterday was Perik Dalet Hey and Vav. At the end of Perik Dalet, the Rambam sort of like summarizes the first 4 Prokim. And the Rambam explains that it was in the first 2 Prokim where he told us all about Maaseh Merkava, meaning the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the details how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. The second, chapter 3 and 4, Perik Gimel and Dalet, the Rambam dedicates to Maaseh Bereishis, which is the details, all the inyanim in the universe. And the Rambam says that these inyanim are extremely delicate inyanim and detailed inyanim, and it is afterwards where the Rambam begins and gets involved in all the halacha inyanim. It is in Perik Hey where he gets involved in the inyanim of Kiddush Hashem and so forth. Just as in the beginning of the Rambam opens the Hakdameh with a pasuk, Ozlei Eivosh Bahabiti al Kol Mitzveisecha, which the Rebbe explained last week. When the Rambam begins Hilchas Yisai de HaTorah, he also quotes a pasuk, and the pasuk is Mishoich Hastecha liYedecha v'Tzitkascha liYishrei Leiv. Stretch Chesed, kindness, liYedecha, to those who are familiar with you, v'Tzitkascha, and your righteousness, liYishrei Leiv, to those who are straight-hearted people. Again, this pasuk must have some sort of a shaykhis to the Sefer Hamada, otherwise the Rambam would not quote it as the beginning before Sefer Hamada. Interestingly, the Rambam in his Hakdamah tells us that one can learn Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and after learning Chamisha Chumshei Torah can learn all of the inyanim in the Rambam. And for this reason the Rambam has named his chibur Mishneh Torah, and then one will have a clear picture on all of the inyanim of Torah. However, we see that at the beginning of various Svarim, the Rambam quotes psukim that are not from Chamisha Chumshei Torah. The Rambam quotes psukim that are from Nevi'im. As the pasuk he quoted at the Hakdamah, Ozlo Yevish Babiti Kol Mitzvah, which is a pasuk in Tilim. The pasuk here, Mesheich Hastecha liYedecha v'Tzitkascha liYishrei Leiv, is also a pasuk in Navi. What shaykhis does it have for the Rambam Bechlal to quote psukim, and why particularly this pasuk? The Rebbe explains this is a sort of a memutza, and in between the Rambam is tying. This is how the Rambam is also tying in Navi into having a shaykhis to his sefer. In other words, the Rambam is telling us as follows: one should learn through Chamisha Chumshei Torah. And here, as well as in further halachas, the Rambam also quotes psukim of Navi, which is, by doing this, the Rambam is creating a memutza, and in between, putting us into contact with Navi as well. The reason why the Rambam is quoting this pasuk here is because the Rambam is beginning Sefer Hamada. He's beginning with Sefer Hamada, and therefore, the Rambam quotes a pasuk, Mishoich Hastecha liYodecha, Mishoich Hastecha liYodecha, reminding us on the inyan of Deyos, Sefer Hamada. The opening words of the Rambam, Yisoid ha-Yisoid Deis va'amud ha-Chochmes, which abbreviates HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name, Leida. The first and foremost that we have to know is Leida, to know the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's an inyan of Yediyah. That is why this inyan has a shaykhus to the pasuk, Mishoy chastecha liyoidecha. To those who get to know you by learning Sefer Hamada. Vitzit koscha liyishre, because the Sefer Hamada, the chelik of Mada and the Rambam concludes with Hilchis Tshuva. Hilchis Tshuva is an inyan of Yishre Leiv. By one doing Tshuva, he straightens out his heart, and that is Vitzit koscha liyishre leiv. Being that this suggestion of learning Rambam in these three different manners is all an inyan in Kedusha, so in Kedusha we must find advantages in each one of them. Now in learning of the Rambam, we know that the derech of the Rambam in his Sefer Yad HaChazaka is the Rambam familiarizes us with all of the mitzvahs. However, the Rambam does not give us the source, does not give us any Maram Mokoim. Also, the Rambam does not give us any reasoning for mitzvahs. Taimei ha-mitzvahs, the Rambam stays away from in his entire Sefer of Yad HaChazaka, Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. In fact, the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe stresses strongly the inyan of Taimei ha-mitzvahs. In the Sefer ha-mitzvahs of the Rambam, we find a completely different inyan. In the Sefer ha-mitzvahs, first of all, the Rambam does give Maram Mekaymis, does give us sources where we can refer to the mitzvah in detail. Another inyan in the Sefer ha-mitzvahs, the Rambam many times does give us timing and reasons for the mitzvahs. And as we know, as the Rambam himself uses the expression in the Izakdome, ha-Torah b'pirusha nitna, Torah was given with all of its explanation and translation. As the Rebbe learned Pshat Achin Shel Pesach on last Shabbos, that the Rambam here is referring to all the shakla v'taya, to all the conversing and pilpulim that come along in Torah. All of this was given to Moshe Sinai. Therefore, we must say that there is an advantage when one can learn Torah and come to the conclusion of the timing, the reasoning of the various mitzvahs or inyanim which we are learning. Therefore, to create some sort of a combination between the advantage that we have for those who are learning Sefer HaMitzvahs and those who are learning the 3 prokim a day, or at least 1 perek a day in the Rambam, the Rebbe suggests, though it is understood that those who are learning 3 prokim a day are really not learning it with all of the shakla v'talya and with all the meforshim and really going through the halachas thoroughly, the Rebbe suggests at least one of the halachas, one halacha in one of the prokim should be learned on a daily basis, and going through this halacha in Shakla V'Tarya and in the Mekayrais, to go through this halacha on a real thorough basis until to come even to the conclusion and to the contact of even the Pnimi Yisra Inyanim, how these Inyanim are related and interpreted al pi Pnimi Yisra Torah as well. And by doing this, for those who are learning the Rambam, they will have the advantage of learning Rambam, and together with it, at least one halacha of the Rambam to be learned in a way of proper shakla v'talya, getting involved in the fullest detail as it is possible for each one of the participants, according to his kol chad v'chad from shiur delay, as one can afford, as one is gifted to, at least to cover one halacha in a format of proper shakla v'talya. As mentioned, the Rambam towards the end of Perek Dalet summarizes the first 4 prokim. And at the very end, Halacha Yud Gimel, the Rambam tells us, in Yonei Abba Prokim Elu, what was discussed in these 4 prokim ties it into the Arba that are nichnasu lepardes. We know the famous Gemara that there were 4 that went into the Pardes and they weren't successful in making it. It is only one Rabbi Akiva that nichnas b'shalom v'yatza b'shalom. V'af al pi shegdoilei Yisrael hayu, the Rambam tells us, they were all great. V'chachamim gdoilim lo hayu, v'chachamim gdoilim hayu, they were all great sages. Loi kulam hoya behen koyach, they all did not have the strength. Leida lahasi kol advarim al buriyim. Therefore, the Rambam says on the Yomer, I suggest, she'ein roy, it is not proper letayel bepardes, for somebody to walk through pardes. In other words, for someone to get involved in all the details of the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and about HaKadosh Baruch Hu creating the world, which this is really what the Rambam discussed in these 4 prokim. As the Rambam himself refers to it, Maisa Bereishis and Maisa Merkava. Maisa Merkava, the Rambam says, is yet harder. Maisa Merkava, the Rambam says, should only be taught in a singular form. In other words, one Talmud, a Rebbe relating to a Talmud, and only when the Talmud shows an extreme anxiety and extreme desire to be familiarized in these inyanim. The Rambam says this should not come first and foremost. Only for the one who has filled himself with bread and with meat. What is lechem ubasa? Lechem ubasa, leidah asur v'hamuta. One should be real familiar in the knowledge of Torah. You should know the halachas, what is asur, what is muta. V'kayotze by mishara mitzvahs. V'afal pi shedvarim elu dava cotton karoisim chachamim. Even though Chazal referred to this as a dava cotton, there's an expression. The Gemara says dava gadol is ma'aseh merkava. V'dava cotton is havayis d'baya v'rava. So if ma'aseh merkava is referred to as a dava gadol, why should that be learned later than the dava cotton? So the Rambam says afal pikein ru'uyin hein lagdimon. That is the right way to learn Torah. Why? Sheheimi yashvin daita shalodam tchila. This is what would set a person's mind properly, that first he should be well familiar in the Yonam of Abaye V'Rava. First he should be good familiar in learning. Then after one is real familiar in learning, that is when he can also permit himself to get involved into the details of Maisa Merkava, Maisa Bereishis. This is what the Rambam himself tells us, where towards the end, after the Rambam concludes explaining all of these in Yonam. The Rebbe says a tremendous question arises here. The Rambam tells us what? That when should we learn in Yonim of Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereishis? After we are well familiar in Yonim of Havayis Tabaya V'Rava. The Rambam himself shows the example of the contrary in his Chivur. The Rambam should have began with in Yonim of Hilchas Issa V'Heta. And then towards the very, very end of the Rambam, that is where he should have put these 4 prokim which tell us the details of Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereishis. Still we see that the Rambam did not do so. The Rambam did the contrary. First he tells us Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereishis, and tells us that it is not worthwhile for a person to get involved in these inyanim in detail. Afterwards the Rambam tells us, after that he tells us that, he gets involved in all the halachas of Issa V'Heta of Torah. Being that every word in the Rambam is extremely accurate, the Rambam himself gives us the answer to this question. If we look carefully into Halacha Yud Gimel, which we just quoted, the Rambam says it is not worthwhile for a person ani omer shein ro letayel bepardes. What is a pshat tayel? Tayel means to go for a walk, to stroll. Pshat, when a person goes for a walk, he really gets involved into every detail. He enjoys the fresh air that he's walking in, and he's observing various inyanim, and this is how he spends the time of his walk. This is what the Rambam tells us. This is taka einay kedai. This is taka not proper for a person to do. However, the basic knowledge of Yisoid HaYisoidos, V'amud HaMetzias, which these are the opening words of the Rambam, to know the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this we have to know first and foremost. And that is why the Rambam puts it taka first and foremost. We have to know the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and this is spelled out in our daily practice, in our daily lives as well. It says, Minig Yisrael for Yidden for many, many years, that what are the very first words of a Yid? As soon as he opens his eyes in the morning, it's Moidani Lefanecha, Melech Chai V'Kayam. Our very first words which we express in the morning is regarding the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one that has created the world and gives strength to the world. Memela, this is something. The only reason we cannot mention HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name when we say Moidani is because at that time we haven't poured Negelwasser yet. In fact, the Rambam himself in these prokim tells us that regarding these inyanim, he's only told us, I'm going to use the expression, Kemar midli, b'negei Maisa Bereishis. He uses the expression, he only gives us like a little bit of a dli. A dli is a bucket, a little bit of the bucket. Drop it about, yeah. In Perek Dalet Halacha Yudi says, Kol advarim elu shedibanu binyan zeh kemar midlihein. And really, the dvarim amukim, these are inyanim that require real in-depth explanation. And towards the end of Perek Beis, the Rambam also uses the expression dvarim elu she'amarnu binyan zeh b'shnei prakim elu kamei tipa min hayam. It's like a drop of the yam, like a drop of the ocean. So really, all the Rambam is telling us, the Rambam in these prakim is not mitayel with us. It's not strolling through with us the inyanim of Ma'aseh Merkava, Ma'aseh Bereishis. This the Rambam tells us we shouldn't. However, that we should know the basic idea that Moida Ani Lefanecha, the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the basics of Ma'aseh Merkava, Ma'aseh Bereishis, this the Rambam finds most important to tell us before we get involved in all the details of Issa Veheta, which the Rambam himself tells us throughout the entire Sefer. But again, the Rashi in this week's Sedre, the Rebbe learned a Rashi in the Parsha, Pittel Chav Beis, Pasuk Chav Ches. Torah tells us, V'shoyer oiseh, oiseh ves benoi lo sishchetu b'yom echad. It is prohibited to shecht, and one day, the mother and the child of a behem. What does Rashi comment? Rashi quotes the word oiseh ves benoi, and tells us, Noyeg b'nekeva. This applies by a female behemoth. She'asal lishchot, it is prohibited to shecht, ha'aim v'haben oy habas. The mother would either its male child or female child on the same day. The Rambam and Rashi adds on, ve'ein noyeg b'schorim. However, this does not apply by males. Umutar. And the Rambam does not just say ve'ein noyeg. I'm sorry. And Rashi does not just say ve'ein noyeg b'schorim. Rashi goes ahead and says umutar lishchay ta'av haben. Goes furthermore that it is permitted to shecht the av and the ben on the same day. The source of this inyan is a debate in Gemara. There's a machlokes hatanoim whether it is permitted to shecht on the same day the male behemoth and his child. The Rambam paskins it is also. Rashi ignores the Chazal and just tells us mutar lishchet ha'ava ben. The only thing the Rambam says, once it was done, in other words, b'diavad, if it was already done, then it is okay. But l'ketchila to go ahead and do so, the Rambam says, based on the Gemara, that one shouldn't. It says throughout the years we came to various klolim in Rashi, and based on these klolim we've learned various pshatim and so forth. However, there's the klal in Rashi which Rashi himself gives us, and b'negeya a klal which we have arrived to. This is debatable. Times we have a Rashi which may come out contradictory to this special klal, but when we have a klal which was given by Rashi himself telling us and stressing numerous times, Rashi telling us that his inyan is only to explain in Yonam al Pi Pshat. What bothers Rashi here in the derech of Pshat, that Rashi has to get involved in a detail bichlal to explain. And if the Rashi does explain, he has to add on an inyan which is nicht ausgehalten al Pi Gemara and al Pi Halacha to tell us that mutar lishchet ha'ava haben. The emes is, if Rashi would have only said the words Ein noyeg b'scharim, it also would have been sufficient. Rashi does not satisfy himself with that. Rashi goes on further and says, Umutar lishchet ha'ava haben. In Pshat Shel Mikra, if we look through all the commentaries on Rashi, and we see what they comment regarding this Rashi, the question still remains, why does Rashi have to get involved in all of these details? The emes is, the Sifsei Chachamim, who's one of the most known commentaries on Rashi. It explains this Rashi that this is similar to Shiluach Hakan. We know of the mitzvah of Shiluach Hakan, which means that we cannot take the eggs while the mother is still there. And that being that applies only by a female. So that is why Shalach Tishalach Esa'im Va'abonim Tikach Lach, as the pasuk tells us. That is why, based on that, Rashi is learning in this mitzvah the same. The child hasn't learned about Shiluach Hakan yet. Shiluach Hakan is a mitzvah which is discussed in Chumash Devarim. The child here is learning Pashas Emor and has no knowledge of Shiluach Hakan yet. Why say that the reason Rashi is explaining this so is due to the mitzvah of Shiluach Hakan? So the Rebbe says, if we look into this pasuk here comes as a continuation to the inyanim which are discussed in this parsha. The inyanim here, the stress on the inyanim which are discussed here, is how the Torah is training Klal Yisrael that Klal Yisrael should behave with chsodim, with rachmanis. Yidden should express feelings of rachmanis through various mitzvahs. And that is why the mitzvahs that are discussed here are not mitzvahs that fall into the category of chukim. Chukim are these type of mitzvahs she'umas ha'olam meshivin aleim, that the goyim are raising questions and do not understand why we were told to observe these mitzvahs. Here we are talking about a complete different category of mitzvahs. As the pasuk begins back in the beginning of Kapitel Chav Beis, Daber el bnei Yisrael v'lo yechalalu Hashem kachi. Hashem's name should not be weakened, should not be desecrated. And therefore all of these mitzvahs are falling into such type of categories. The mitzvah here is a mitzvah which is expressing a feeling of Rahman. And that is why this is a reason of Rahmanis. It's a midas harachmanis that the Torah is instilling into us, and that is why we were commanded this mitzvah. We have just also learned, here in the pasuk of Zayin, Rashi stresses Shoyrei Chesed v'Yeis Ki Yavoleit. Rashi explains Ki Yavoleit Prat Liyotzei Doifen. If it's born in a regular form of birth, this halacha applies. Otherwise, the halacha does not apply. The Rebbe is learning. Why is this so? Being that the behemoth had so much, if it's not a regular type of labor, so much aggravation and tzar because of the birth of this behemoth that is being born. Therefore, this already arouses within the behemoth a feeling not to care that much for this infant. However, where it is a regular labor, there's a feeling of rachmanis between the mother, the female behemoth, and the behemoth which was born. And again, regardless whether it is a male or a female what was born, this is no chilik, because the feelings are the same. And that is why, as a midah of rachmanis, the Torah has told us of this mitzvah. Benegeya, the father, Rabbi explained earlier when he was discussing the beginning of the Rashi, when the child learns the Chumash, the Rashi, Rabbi added on, the child really does not know much of a difference whether it is ha'av ubein or ha'em ubein, bein or bas. It is not popular for a child to go to the shlachtos and see how the slaughtering of the behemoth is done. And even if we were to go that far that a child did go to a shlachtos and does observe how the behemoths are geschachten, the child, it will never dawn on the child to go to the butcher and make inquiries whether it is oisev es benoi or two strange behemoths. It's not common, it's not popular by the child to go after such type of investigative questions. However, the mother and the child, we know who the mother is and we know who the child. As far as the father of the behemoth and the child, this is something which is, in most cases, it is very hard to identify and to be able to keep track who is the father of this behemoth. unless we were to go to a far-off island and just keep these two behemoths there, and then we'd be able to know that this is the father of the behemoth. Therefore, Rashi feels that there is no inyan in terms of Pshuta Shel Mikra. Rabbi always keeps on stressing, Rashi and Chumash is not a halacha sefer. So Rashi is really not paskening halachas for us. But in terms of Pshuta Shel Mikra, for the child to understand properly the pasuk, the child can understand very well why we are prohibited to shecht oisay ves benoi b'yoyim echad. However, at the same time, the child can very well understand why mutar lishchet ha'av haben, because for us to go ahead and keep track which is the av and which is the bain, by behemoths it is something which is very hard and very unusual. That is why the Torah has told us mutar lishchet ha'av haben in the realm of Pshuta Shel Mikra. However, her aim and the children, we are taking out a lot of shech. Kmanis is felt and seen between the mother and the child. On the average, we don't even know who the father in the behemoth, who is the father of this behemoth. So therefore, there is no need to tell us. There's no reason to tell us that we are not allowed to shech the father and the infant and his child on the same day. As it is customary in the summer Shabbosim, the Rebbe Zalgazunzain also explains a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. There's a Mishnah in Perek Beis, which is today's Perek, which is a quotation of a Tana. Hillel Oimer. Af ra gilgoilas achas shetzofa al pnei hamayim. He saw there was a skull swimming over the waters. Amalo, he told her, al da'atfeich atfuch. Because you drowned somebody else, that is why you were drowned. V'soif mitayfayich yitufun. Those that have drowned you will also be drowned. Very strange Mishnah. A Mishnah in Aramaic, as opposed to all the Mishnahs which are in Lashon HaKodesh here in the Perek. Quotation of Hillel saw a skull. Where was he? Did it happen in a cemetery? Rabbi says there's a halacha that in the cemetery we're not allowed to learn Divrei Torah, because it is a loyeg l'rosh. We are considered like laughing from those who are not, they are not in the position of being able to learn Torah at that time anymore. So whom did Hillel tell this to? Also, what is the diak in the Mishnah? Afhu ra gilgoilas achas. It's a certain type of a skull. It's not stam afhu ra gilgoilas. The Mishnah is stressing ra gilgoilas achas. He saw a special gilgoilas. Who was the gilgoilas? Rebbe says there are svarim that say that this gilgoilas achas that Hillel was referring to was the Gulgoilas of Pari Melech Mitzrayim. And that is why it's not Stama Gulgoilas, it's Gulgoilas Achas, the one special Gulgoilas. Now where was Hillel? Hillel was either in Bavel or in Eretz Yisrael. That's how we find Hillel, where Hillel resided, which is quite a distance from Mitzrayim. What happened? Some sort of a ness happened. The Gulgoilas, the skull of Pari Melech Mitzrayim, floated and came from Mitzrayim until Hillel. Something very strange. And what did Hillel tell him? Al da'atfeich atfuch. In other words, it seems that this Gilgoilas of Paroi did not have any menucha, did not have any rest. After Paroi came to the eternal world, did not have any rest, and was wandering until it came to Hillel, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu performed this ness that came to a completely different geographic area. And Hillel told Paroi, Al da'atfeich atfuch, because you have drowned others. Paroi is known for that. This is the decree that he made, that every Jewish child that was born should be thrown into water. That is why he deserved the punishment of atfuch. However, this did not calm Paroi yet. Hillel had to add on, v'soif, the end is, mitefayich yitufun. Those that have drowned you will also be drowned. The Rebbe says corresponds to what the Alter Rebbe explains in the Geras HaKodesh, that at times there is an inyan that min hashamayim it was nigzer on somebody to be in nizik, to receive some sort of a damage, chas v'shalom. However, the one who is the mazik, the one who is bringing him the damage, there is no inyan in volunteering to bring damage to another yid. And therefore, the one who's bringing the damage, though on one hand, he's bringing it to somebody who deserves it, because Hashem Amalek Halil, in other words, this is a punishment which HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to bring to this individual. However, at the same time, the one who's fulfilling it, he is a mazik. And as far as he's concerned, he's causing damage without any reason. He doesn't know that there's a motive behind it here, that this particular person, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, has set aside that he should receive some sort of a damage. The same has been again the Mishnah here in Avos. Al dat feich atfuch. So Pari received his einish, and Pari deserved that einish. Why? Because it was in the format of midah keneged midah. However, the Mishnah Hillel did not leave until he completed the thought, and it seems like that Pari did not get any menucha until he heard the entire idea. He had to hear the other half from Hillel as well. That seif mitei fayich yitufim. And now we understand very well also why this Mishnah is discussed not in Lashon HaKodesh, because this is it originated from where Hillel addressed himself to Pari Melech Mitzrayim. That's why he wasn't able to express himself in Lashon HaKodesh, but he rather used the language of Aramaic. And that is why it is quoted the same way.
So,
as a hemshech to Achen Shel Pesach, the Achen Shel Pesach the Farbrengen, the Rebbe said a maimah based on the pasuk v'kocha toichlu oisai. Masneichem chagurem, naleichem beragleichem, makelchem beyetchem, which is the pasuk which describes how the Yidden ate the Korban Pesach. Being that we still have a shaykh, still a hemshech to the Achen Shel Pesach and to Pesach in general. Rabbi mentioned here in Indian, he says, which you really should have mentioned it in the Achen Shel Pesach the Farbrengen. And that is, Benegay, those that went in the Tahalucha of Achen Shel Pesach, and this corresponds to the idea of going just like when the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, Makelchem b'yetchem, and especially the weather which was going on in Yontev, it was rain. This was definitely something which is not too pleasant for Simchas Yontev, and though did exist such a weather, not taking all this into consideration, still went in a format of simcha, with simcha, and to share simcha with other Yidden, and to bring a message of simcha to Yidden and other shuls. This, the Rebbe says, corresponds to a pasuk. There's a pasuk in Tehillim, Beis Elikim nahalech berogesh. So it's brought in Svarim that to Beis Elikim, to a shul, we will go under all circumstances. Berogesh stands as an abbreviation of Be, Reish, stands for Ruach, whether there's a strong wind outside. Gimel is Geshem, and the Shin is Shelik, which shows us that to the Beis Elikim we are to go regardless what type of a weather it is. And therefore, this opportunity the Rebbe appreciates. Those that went in the Tahalucha, though it was such a weather, it was a rainy weather, it wasn't a pleasant weather, and this also, especially being that it was on Pesach, it was with the spirit, like the Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, Naleichem, Beragleichem, V'makelchem, B'yetchem, and so forth. Talking about the importance of learning Rambam, Rebbe also expressed thanks to those who have written their comments and raised various questions of the Rambam, which were printed in the various publications, which are printed, the Ha'aras HaTmimim, which come out through the various yeshivas which discuss, raise questions, and various sichas and so forth. There were many individuals that also had certain shailas, questions which aroused while they were learning the Rambam this week, and they put their questions into writing, and the Rebbe says he's extremely thankful for it. Talking about the union of learning Rambam, which this is, as the Rebbe mentioned originally, that this is one of the reasons is because through this we will have an opportunity to familiarize ourselves in all mitzvahs HaTorah. Rebbe mentioned that there are like many inyonim that obligate us to learn Torah. First of all, there is an inyan of leidas hamayis asher yasun, There's a chiyuv on each and every yid that we have to know how to fulfill mitzvahs. Being that we have to know how to fulfill mitzvahs, the only way we will know how to fulfill mitzvahs is by learning Torah, which teaches us how to fulfill the mitzvahs. There's another inyan, which the Alter Rebbe quotes in Hilchos Talmud Torah, which tells us that each and every yid is obligated to learn the entire Torah. So not a chiyuv in Talmud Torah. Then we have from the Alter Rebbe in Lekutei Torah, there's a maimon Pashas Kedoshim v'hadarta pnei zokin. And in that maimon, the Alter Rebbe discusses the greatness of learning inyanim and Torah by heart. In fact, that is what Alter Rebbe explains. Why do we rise for a Talmud Chacham when he enters into a room, though at this time he's not learning? Because we're talking about somebody who's a Talmud Chacham, definitely has inyanim and Torah in his mind, and though we do not see him with a sefer, he's probably walking and thinking inyanim and Torah. So we see that there's an importance that while we are not at a sefer, while we are walking or traveling or whatever we may be doing, we should be in a position of having inyanim and Torah in our mind. And there Alter Rebbe in Lekutei Torah tells us that the most appropriate inyanim to study Baal Peh are inyanim that have a shaychus to kodshim, to korbanos. Then we have this inyan of learning Torah, which we just discussed, that one has to go through all of the Taryag mitzvahs, which is aside of the Leidas HaMayis Asher Yasun. Here we're talking even about mitzvahs that are not in existence nowadays. However, there's still a chiyuv on the yid that every yid has to be familiar in all of the Taryag mitzvahs, which is the reason why the Rebbe suggested to learn the Rambam. So we see from this that there are, from various angles, many chiyuvim upon a yid that obligate him to learn Torah in different ways. Towards the end of the Farbrengen, where the Rebbe stressed that it is time, we are ready towards the end of Golus, and we are ready for the coming of Mashiach, and he referred to an expression from the Frierdiker Rebbe that all we have to do is we have to put on the kneplach. Now this is an expression from the Frierdiker Rebbe whereby he describes each and every yid as a soldier in the army of Hashem. And when a soldier is in the army, his clothes have to be perfect. Not only his clothes have to be perfect, but even the buttons on his jacket have to shine properly. The Rebbe says all we have to do now is, which is like the last and final touch, is we have to see to it that our buttons should be shining properly. And if our buttons will be shining properly, then we will be ready for the coming of Mashiach. Talking about buttons, the Rebbe says that a button usually is, there are two ideas in buttons. Sometimes a button is there without any function, just there for beauty of the garment. And at times, the function of a button is to bring together two sides of the garment. The minig Yisrael, Hayidin always used to wear a garment buttoned, was always that the right side of the garment came over the left side. The Rebbe says this is a minig Yisrael, which Yidden for many years have been acting in accordance to this minig, and it also expresses something spiritual as well. It means that the right side, we all know what the right side stands for and what the left side stands for. The right side has to see and overcome the left side and utilize and have hashpah on the left side. So that is why the minig Yisrael is when we're dealing with buttons, which bring together two ends of garments, to see to it that the right side always overrules and is always above and has a hashpah and controls the left side. Towards the end of Farbrengen, the Rebbe also mentioned, it is appropriate, the Rebbe says, to mention regarding all the miftzayim, and this new union of learning Rambam, and being that we are before the summer, it is also extremely important to see to it, Benegei Miftzah Chinuch in general, but particularly it is very important before the summer. We spoke about it at Lentach and Shel Pesach and urged us today again that summer is a time which can have a very meaningful hashpah on a child, and therefore we are to see to it that wherever we can just reach out to see to it that all Jewish children should be able to spend their summer in a proper environment and in a proper svive, which this would lead to it that the child should receive a proper chinuch through the entire year, and particularly to see that the summer months are utilized accordingly. I mentioned all of the other miftzayim as well as Miftzah Sefer Torah, to see to it that every yid has a shaychus, has shaykhs to a Sefer Torah by having a letter in the Sefer Torah and Sefer Torah HaKlolis, as well as all other of the Mivtzoyim, to see to it, to reach out to as many Yidden as we can, and ultimately to all of Klal Yisrael, to reach them with the Mivtzoyim.